Sometimes the ones everyone gives up on are carrying the very thing somebody else has spent years trying to find. Snow drifted slowly through the Montana mountains like the sky itself had grown tired of hurrying. Winter always arrived quietly in Blackwater Ridge, settling over old cabins, frozen roads, and lonely places where people learned how to live without asking much from the world anymore. The Animal Rescue Center sat near the edge of town, where pine trees stood taller than streetlights and silence often felt heavier than conversation. Inside the shelter, warmth carried the smell of old blankets, coffee gone cold too fast, and quiet disappointment nobody liked speaking about out loud. Near the back kennel, tucked far enough away that visitors rarely wandered past, a German shepherd rested against folded blankets that had stopped feeling temporary months ago. His name was Shadow, 7 years old, former military working dog, once trained to run beside men carrying impossible missions into dangerous places nobody talked about afterward. But now, most people only noticed what no longer worked. His hind legs barely moved. One side of his body dragged when he tried standing too quickly. His fur remained thick and healthy, but something quieter had faded from his eyes over time. Not anger, not fear, something heavier than that. Hope, maybe. A handwritten folder rested quietly on the front of his kennel. Special needs, limited mobility, medical costs high, difficult long-term placement. Returned 3 times. Nobody wrote the hardest truth inside the paperwork. Nobody needed to. People walked past his kennel every day. Families searching for playful dogs stopped at younger puppies instead. Volunteers tried. They really did. But sympathy rarely survived long enough to become responsibility. Earlier that morning, 2 shelter staff members stood quietly near the office while snow pressed softly against the windows. The veterinarian said tomorrow morning. One woman whispered carefully, arms folded tightly against herself. He is struggling more lately. The older volunteer sighed softly. Feels wrong. I know. Silence settled between them. Hard kind of silence. The type people carried when there were no good answers left. Because sometimes rescue work hurt in ways nobody prepared for. Sometimes kindness ran out before time did. Shadow rested quietly through most of the afternoon, unmoving except for slow breathing and the occasional lift of tired amber eyes whenever footsteps passed nearby. Most days looked exactly the same now. Visitors glanced briefly, smiled sadly, moved on. Nobody stayed long. Nobody asked questions. Around 3:30 that afternoon, tires crunched softly through snow outside the shelter entrance. A dark pickup truck pulled slowly into the parking lot beneath gray winter skies. Ryan Mercer stepped out wearing an old dark jacket lined against mountain cold, boots worn from years of work that left little room for comfort. 46 years old, former Navy SEAL, quiet in ways people often misunderstood. Living alone long enough had turned silence into habit. Divorce years earlier had not shattered him exactly, but it had changed something permanent. These days he mostly kept to himself. Small cabin outside town. Occasional veteran volunteer work. Repair jobs when people asked. Fewer conversations than most people probably considered healthy. He came to Silver Pine Rescue twice a year to drop off supplies. Blankets, dog food, medication donations when he could afford them. Nothing dramatic. Just habit. Quiet kindness without wanting attention. Linda Harper greeted him near the entrance with tired warmth. Ryan Mercer, she said softly. You always show up when winter gets ugly. Ryan gave the smallest smile. Dogs deserve better than cold weather. Linda laughed quietly before helping unload boxes. The shelter felt busier than usual that afternoon. Barking carried through narrow hallways while volunteers moved between kennels. Ryan never rushed through visits. He usually walked the shelter afterward, saying hello to older dogs people overlooked. Strange thing about military life. You learned quickly who got forgotten first. Near the back hallway, something made him stop. Maybe instinct. Maybe coincidence. Hard to say later. One kennel stood quieter than the others. No barking. No movement. Just stillness. Shadow rested there near the back wall exactly as before. At first Ryan almost walked past. Then the dog lifted his head. Slowly. Carefully. Amber eyes fixed directly on him. Not curious. Not nervous. Focused somehow. Recognition almost. Ryan paused without understanding why. That one usually does not react much, Linda said quietly from behind him. Ryan kept looking toward the kennel. Shadow had not moved further, Yet something strange settled inside the room now. Silence, but different somehow. Heavy. Familiar. The German shepherd tried shifting forward. One paw, then another, struggling slightly before stopping halfway across the blanket. Still watching, Ryan crouched slowly without thinking. "Hey there," he said quietly. Shadow's ears lifted just slightly. Small movement, barely noticeable. Yet Linda blinked in surprise nearby. "That is..." She hesitated. "Actually kind of unusual." Ryan frowned faintly. "What happened to him?" Linda exhaled carefully. "Former K-9. Military background." She paused briefly. "Paralyzed after an operation injury." Ryan looked back toward the dog. Something about the word military landed strangely inside him. Familiar territory. Familiar pain. Nobody wanted medical responsibility. Linda continued softly. "Tomorrow was supposed to be..." She stopped herself. Did not finish. Did not need to. Ryan understood anyway. Shelter silence had a way of saying hard things without words. Shadow remained still now. Watching him. Not begging. Not desperate. Just waiting somehow. Like he already understood disappointment too well to expect much anymore. Ryan stood slowly after several quiet moments. "I should get going," he muttered softly, almost to himself. But halfway toward the hallway exit, something made him stop. Behind him came the soft sound of movement against concrete. Ryan turned. Shadow had dragged himself several feet forward despite obvious effort. Not barking. Not whining. Just watching again. Waiting. Quiet as winter itself. And for reasons Ryan Mercer could not explain yet, leaving suddenly felt harder than it should have. Ryan Mercer told himself 3 separate times on the drive home that evening he was not coming back for the dog. Snow moved slowly across the windshield while mountain roads disappeared beneath fading daylight. And still something about those quiet amber eyes stayed with him longer than expected. Strange thing about loneliness was how quickly it recognized itself in another living thing. His cabin sat nearly 15 miles outside Blackwater Ridge, where pine trees swallowed most sounds after sunset. Quiet place. Too quiet some nights. Ryan liked it that way most of the time. Former Navy SEALs learned how to live with silence better than most people, though nobody ever mentioned how silence changed after enough years alone. Inside, the cabin looked exactly the same as it had for years. One coffee mug beside the sink. Wood stove burning low. Boots left near the front door. Too much stillness resting in rooms built for more people than one man needed. Ryan reheated leftover stew and tried not thinking about the shelter. Tried not thinking about tomorrow morning either. Funny thing was, he had seen difficult endings before. Military life prepared people for hard realities. But something about that German shepherd unsettled him. Maybe because the dog never begged. Never acted desperate. Just looked tired in the way old soldiers sometimes looked after carrying too much for too long. Around 8:30 that evening, Ryan sat quietly near the fire with untouched coffee cooling beside him. Snow tapped softly against cabin windows while darkness settled across the mountains. Without meaning to, he kept replaying the same image inside his head. Shadow dragging himself forward across cold concrete. Not whining. Not asking for pity. Just trying. Ryan rubbed tired hands across his face. "Not your problem," he muttered quietly into the empty room. Yet somehow the room felt emptier after saying it. Morning arrived gray and cold. Ryan woke earlier than usual after sleeping worse than expected. Strange dreams. Restless thoughts. He stood near the kitchen window watching winter move through pine trees before finally muttering something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like surrender. By 9:30, his truck rolled slowly back into Silver Pine Rescue parking lot. Linda Harper looked up from paperwork near the front desk and stopped mid-sentence. "You came back," she said quietly. Ryan shrugged once. "Just asking questions." Linda smiled faintly in the way people did when they already knew more than they planned to say. 10 minutes later, Ryan sat quietly inside the office while Shadow rested nearby on folded blankets. Closer now. Easier to notice details. Gray beginning around the muzzle. Scar hidden beneath thick fur near one shoulder. Stillness that looked less like weakness and more like exhaustion. Linda placed an old file folder gently on the desk. "Former military K-9, she explained softly. Worked alongside special tactical teams. Ryan frowned slightly. "Military?" Linda nodded. "That part of his records is limited." She hesitated briefly. "What we do know is he was injured during an operation several years ago." Ryan looked toward Shadow again. The dog watched him quietly but calmly. No fear, no excitement, just awareness. Linda continued. After surgery, mobility never fully returned. Her voice softened. Medical costs got expensive. Return once. Return twice. Then again. Families wanted healthy dogs. Energetic dogs. Easier dogs. Nobody wanted appointments, medication schedules, lifting support, or uncertainty. Ryan leaned back quietly. Familiar feeling moved somewhere deep inside him now. Because people said similar things about broken veterans too sometimes. Too difficult. Too quiet. Too damaged. Hard truth nobody liked admitting. Shadow shifted slightly then, dragging himself closer without struggle in his expression. Calm determination somehow. Ryan crouched carefully beside him. You stubborn? He asked softly. Shadow simply held eye contact. Linda folded her arms nearby. Honestly, she said quietly. He stopped responding to most people weeks ago. Ryan exhaled slowly. Tomorrow morning? Linda nodded once. Silence settled hard inside the room. Outside, snow touched shelter windows softly. Somewhere nearby, another dog barked excitedly, while volunteers carried supplies through narrow hallways. Life moving forward the way it always did. Ryan looked back toward Shadow. Quiet dog. Broken body maybe. But something inside those eyes still stayed awake. Waiting. What if? Ryan said carefully, almost annoyed with himself already. I take him for the weekend. Linda blinked once. Weekend foster? Ryan nodded reluctantly. Temporary. Linda smiled carefully. Temporary. She repeated like she had heard the word many times before. Nearly an hour later, Shadow rested quietly inside the back of Ryan's truck beneath warm blankets and support padding. Snow drifted softly through mountain roads while the cabin waited somewhere ahead. Neither one seemed entirely sure what came next. But for the first time and longer than anyone at the shelter remembered, Shadow had eaten his full breakfast. And before we continue this quiet journey of second chances and impossible discoveries, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable stories waiting just ahead. Ryan glanced briefly into the rearview mirror during the drive. Shadow remained awake, watching him calmly. Not scared, not restless, just present somehow. Strange feelings settled quietly inside Ryan's chest then. Something unfamiliar after too many lonely years. Responsibility maybe. Or hope. Dangerous word. But sometimes the hardest thing about healing was not starting again. Sometimes it was believing somebody might finally stay. The drive to Ryan Mercer's cabin took nearly 40 minutes through snow-covered roads where pine trees stretched endlessly across the Montana mountains like silent witnesses to things people no longer spoke about. Late afternoon light had already begun fading by the time Ryan turned off the main road and followed the narrow gravel path toward home. Snow crunched softly beneath the truck tires while cold wind carried through frozen branches overhead. In the back seat, Shadow rested quietly on folded blankets without making a sound. No nervous pacing, no whining, no fear, just stillness. Ryan checked the rearview mirror more times than he planned to admit. The German Shepherd remained awake, amber eyes calm and observant, watching the changing scenery outside as though none of it felt unfamiliar. Strange thing was, the dog looked less frightened than Ryan expected, almost like somebody returning somewhere they had seen before. Ryan shook the thought away. Cabin life had a way of making ordinary things feel stranger after enough years alone. The house sat at the edge of a wooded ridge overlooking frozen hills and pine valleys below. Old cedar siding. Small front porch. Smoke rising softly from the chimney. Practical place. Quiet place. Built years ago with plans for a future that never quite stayed the way Ryan imagined. He parked near the porch and stepped carefully around the truck. Cold air hit harder now that sunset had begun sinking behind the mountains. All right, he muttered softly while opening the truck door. Guess this is home for the weekend. Shadow remained still for a moment. Ryan crouched carefully and adjusted the support harness Linda packed earlier. Easy now. The dog shifted slowly. Front paws first. Then effort. Slow, determined effort. Ryan noticed immediately how much work simple movement required. No complaint from Shadow. No frustration. Just patience. Kind that only arrived after learning hard things the long way. Ryan carefully lifted part of the dog's weight while guiding him toward the cabin. Snow pressed lightly against Shadow's fur while cold air curled around both of them. Strange picture really. A former Navy SEAL helping an injured military dog across frozen ground like neither one entirely trusted themselves to need somebody else again. Inside, warmth settled around them immediately. Wood stove burning low. Faint smell of pine and old coffee lingering in quiet rooms. Ryan laid blankets near the fire and stepped back. Not exactly luxury, he said quietly. But it works. Shadow lowered himself carefully onto the blankets and looked around. No panic. No uncertainty. Just watching. Always watching. Ryan grabbed water and prepared medication instructions Linda had packed inside a folder. Shelter schedule. Feeding notes. Physical therapy suggestions. All practical things. Temporary responsibilities. Weekend responsibilities. That was all. Yet something about the room already felt different. Less empty somehow. By dinner time, Ryan warmed canned food recommended for recovery and placed it carefully nearby. Shadow hesitated briefly before eating slowly but steadily. Full bowl gone for the second time in 2 days. Improvement, maybe. Or trust. Hard to tell yet. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the mountains. Night arrived quickly out here. Darkness settled deep beyond cabin windows until forest shadows swallowed everything farther than 30 feet from the porch. Ryan sat quietly near the fireplace later that evening holding untouched coffee while old country radio played softly in the background. Shadow rested nearby. Calm. Silent. Breathing steady. For a while, neither one asked much from the night except peace. Then something changed. Near 10 o'clock, Ryan noticed movement. Shadow slowly lifted his head. Ears alert now. Eyes focused somewhere deeper inside the cabin. Not frightened. Intent. Purposeful. Ryan frowned slightly. What is it? The dog tried standing. Slow effort again. Front paws steady while weakened hind legs dragged carefully against wooden flooring. Ryan watched quietly. Shadow was heading somewhere. Not wandering. Moving with intention. Through the hallway. Past the kitchen. Toward the back section of the house Ryan barely used anymore. The old workshop. Strange room. Locked most days. Filled with storage boxes nobody touched. Military gear packed years earlier. Memories Ryan stopped opening after life became quieter than expected. Shadow stopped near the hallway entrance. Watching the door. Waiting. Ryan crossed his arms. You cannot possibly want back there. Shadow looked toward him once. Then back at the door. Silence. Ryan almost laughed softly. No, the dog remained still. Watching. 5 minutes later Ryan returned to his chair. Yet something unsettled stayed inside the room now. 20 minutes passed. Shadow still stared toward the hallway. Not restless. Just waiting. Around midnight Ryan finally checked again. Same thing. Same position. Amber eyes fixed toward the locked workshop door at the far end of the hall. Like something inside mattered more than sleep. Ryan leaned quietly against the wall, studying him. You smell something? No reaction. Mouse. Nothing. Just patience. Quiet determination. Somewhere deep beneath old floorboards, the house creaked softly as mountain wind shifted outside. Ryan suddenly realized something strange then. Shadow had explored nothing else inside the cabin. Not kitchen. Not couch. Not fireplace. Only that hallway. Only that locked room. Strange feeling moved quietly through Ryan's chest. Curiosity mixed with something harder to explain. Because military dogs trained with purpose rarely acted randomly. And for reasons he could not fully understand yet, the old locked workshop suddenly felt less forgotten than it had yesterday. Morning arrived slowly across the Montana mountains, the kind of winter morning that moved quietly through pine trees and settled softly against cabin windows before most people even realized the night had ended. Ryan Mercer stood near the kitchen sink holding black coffee gone cooler than he remembered pouring while snow drifted lazily outside. Sleep had come in pieces. Light sleep. Strange sleep. Not because of old memories for once. Because of a dog. More specifically, because of what the dog had spent nearly half the night doing. Watching one locked door like it mattered more than rest. Ryan glanced toward the hallway again. Same thing. Shadow remained near the old workshop entrance exactly where he had finally fallen asleep sometime after midnight. Curled near the door. Patient. Still. Like standing guard over something invisible. Ryan frowned slightly to himself. You really are stubborn, he muttered quietly. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of Ryan's voice. Calm amber eyes met his for a moment before shifting back toward the workshop. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Just certain somehow. Strange thing about military dogs was instinct rarely left them completely. Ryan knew that much. Years of tactical work taught him one lesson better than most. Trained dogs did not obsess over nothing, especially dogs who had spent years learning precision, purpose, recognition. After breakfast, Ryan carefully adjusted Shadow's support harness before helping him outside briefly into the cold morning air. Snow crunched beneath boots while sunlight pushed weakly through thick winter clouds. Shadow moved slowly but with more determination than expected, taking careful steps despite limited strength in his hind legs. No complaints, no frustration, just effort. Back inside, Ryan tried ignoring the strange pull toward the locked workshop. Tried reading. Failed. Tried fixing loose shelving near the mudroom. Failed again. Every time he looked up, Shadow remained there, watching the same door, waiting. By late afternoon, Ryan finally sighed heavily. All right. Silence filled the cabin. You win. He walked toward the hallway while Shadow slowly lifted himself, dragging carefully behind with sudden alertness Ryan had not seen before. The old workshop sat at the far end of the house behind a faded wooden door scratched lightly by years of weather and neglect. Ryan had barely stepped inside since moving here permanently after retirement. Mostly storage now. Old boxes. Forgotten gear. Things easier left untouched. He unlocked the door slowly. Cold stale air greeted them immediately. Dust drifted softly through weak afternoon light slipping between narrow windows. The room smelled faintly of cedar, metal, and years nobody bothered disturbing. Ryan stepped inside first. See, he muttered quietly. Nothing exciting. Shelves lined the walls stacked with forgotten camping equipment, military trunks, fishing gear, unopened boxes, old photographs shoved carelessly into corners of memory people stopped visiting. Shadow moved differently now. Focused, purposeful. Slowly, carefully, he crossed the room despite obvious effort. Ryan watched closely. The German shepherd ignored everything. No wandering, no curiosity. Straight toward the far wall behind an old workbench covered in dusty tools. Then he stopped, stared downward, waited. Ryan crossed his arms. What exactly are you looking for? Shadow lowered his nose near the floorboards. One soft scratch, then another. Deliberate. Slow. Ryan frowned. No, the dog scratched again. Same spot. Same calm certainty. Ryan hesitated. Floorboards old enough to creak beneath weight. Shelving unit pushed against the wall nearby. He almost laughed at himself for even considering it. Yet something unsettled moved quietly through him now. Instinct recognizing instinct maybe. With a tired sigh, Ryan stepped closer and pulled the shelving unit aside inch by inch. Dust scattered across old wood beneath it. Nothing obvious at first. Then something strange caught his attention. One section of flooring looked different. Slightly newer. Cleaner edges around the frame. Ryan crouched slowly. What the hell? He pressed against the panel carefully. Nothing. Tried again. This time it shifted slightly. Hidden compartment. Small. Nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Silence deepened around the room. Even wind outside seemed quieter somehow. Ryan carefully lifted the panel open. Inside rested a weathered military lockbox coated lightly with dust. Black metal. Scratched edges. Faded markings barely visible beneath years of neglect. Ryan froze completely. Familiar shape. Familiar design. Military issue. Navy storage. His breathing slowed. Hands suddenly still. No, he whispered quietly, almost without meaning to, because stamped faintly along one side sat something impossible. A name scratched into old metal years earlier in careless block letters. D. Mercer. Ryan stared hard enough to convince himself he read it wrong. But he had not. Daniel Mercer. His younger brother. Gone nearly 8 years. Official reports said missing during overseas operations. No body recovered. No answers ever fully explained. Ryan swallowed hard. Slowly lowered himself onto the dusty floor beside the box. Shadow remained close now. Watching calmly. Waiting again. Not anxious. Not surprised. Almost like he had known this moment would come eventually. Ryan's fingers hovered uncertainly over the metal latch. Heart heavier somehow than it had felt in years. Because impossible things were not supposed to happen in forgotten workshops buried inside lonely cabins. Yet somehow, after all this time, a paralyzed dog everyone else gave up on had led him straight towards something he never stopped quietly wondering about. Ryan Mercer sat motionless on the dusty workshop floor for longer than he realized, cold air lingering around him while weak afternoon light stretched slowly across forgotten shelves. The military lockbox rested between his hands like something pulled from another life. A life he stopped trying to fully understand years ago. Daniel Mercer, younger brother. 8 years gone. Official reports called it an operational loss. Classified details. Limited disclosure. No answers that ever made enough sense to settle grief properly. Ryan remembered standing in government offices listening to careful voices explain things nobody truly explained. Sometimes loss arrived with funerals. Sometimes it arrived unfinished. Harder kind of grief. Shadow remained beside him quietly, watching with the same calm focus he had carried since arriving at the cabin. No excitement. No urgency. Almost as though he had only been waiting for Ryan to catch up to something the dog already understood. Ryan swallowed hard before finally unlatching the weathered box. Metal clicked softly through the quiet room. Inside sat old folders wrapped carefully against moisture, military maps folded neatly, faded photographs, and several sealed envelopes worn soft at the edges from age. Ryan hesitated. Something inside his chest tightened unexpectedly. Because grief had strange timing. Sometimes it waited years before finding the exact moment to walk back into the room. He reached first for the photographs. One image nearly stopped his breathing altogether. Daniel stood smiling beneath desert sunlight, wearing tactical gear Ryan recognized immediately from old deployments. Younger, happier, alive. Beside him sat a German shepherd. Same intelligent amber eyes. Same black and tan markings. Younger then, but unmistakable. Shadow. Ryan stared harder. Turned the picture slightly. On the back, handwritten words in familiar, messy block letters. Shadow still refuses to listen. Good thing he saves everybody anyway. Ryan lowered the photograph slowly. No, he whispered under his breath. Shadow watched him quietly from nearby. Ryan looked back toward the dog now with entirely different eyes. You knew him. The words barely sounded real once spoken aloud. Strange thing about grief was how quickly disbelief tried protecting people from hope. Ryan reached for another envelope, hands slower now. Inside rested folded pages written in Daniel's handwriting. Familiar handwriting Ryan had not seen in nearly a decade. One letter stood out immediately because Daniel had written something strange near the top. If Ryan ever finds this, it means Shadow did his job. Ryan stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, wind moved softly through pine trees while snow brushed against cabin windows far away in the other room. Silence settled differently now. He continued reading carefully. Daniel explained pieces of a mission Ryan had never fully known about. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just quiet truths hidden beneath military language. Shadow had served alongside Daniel during overseas recovery work involving civilians trapped during dangerous operations. The dog saved lives repeatedly. Protected children, found missing people, stayed beside frightened strangers when chaos overwhelmed everyone else. But near the end of one mission, everything changed. Daniel described injury, confusion, separation, not fear exactly, sadness maybe, because before deployment ended, Daniel realized Shadow would likely retire injured someday. He worried about what happened next. Ryan read slower now. One sentence stood apart from everything else. If anything ever happens to me, promise me one thing, little brother. If Shadow ever finds his way back to you somehow, do not let him believe he was forgotten too. Ryan lowered the letter slowly. The room felt smaller suddenly. Heavier. Like old grief had quietly reopened without permission. You have got to be kidding me, Ryan muttered softly, though nothing inside him truly doubted it anymore. Shadow shifted carefully closer, lowering himself beside Ryan with visible effort. Calm. Present. Ryan looked toward him again. All this time, the German shepherd rested quietly, head lowering against Ryan's leg like the answer had always been obvious. Strange thing was, Ryan suddenly understood something impossible. Shadow had recognized him the moment he entered the shelter. Not coincidence. Recognition. Memory. Maybe loyalty too strong for time to erase completely. Ryan exhaled shakily before reaching down, fingers resting gently against thick fur near Shadow's shoulder. You carried this all these years? Shadow stayed still beneath his hand. Warm. Steady. Alive. Ryan looked back toward the photographs scattered around them. Daniel laughing beside campfires. Shadow younger, alert beside him. Familiar brotherly smile Ryan had nearly forgotten how to picture clearly anymore. Hard thing about grief was how memories slowly softened edges until faces sometimes felt farther away than people deserved. Yet here, somehow, pieces remained, waiting quietly inside a hidden room no one bothered opening. Ryan sat there until evening darkened the workshop windows. Snow still falling outside. Fire crackling faintly somewhere deeper inside the cabin. For the first time in years, grief felt different somehow. Still painful, but less unfinished, less lonely. Because somehow, against every reasonable explanation, the one companion Daniel trusted most had dragged himself through pain, abandonment, and nearly losing everything just to finish something nobody else even knew remained unfinished. Ryan looked down quietly toward Shadow again. "Guess you found your way home after all," he whispered softly. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, the old German shepherd finally rested his head fully against Ryan's knee and closed his eyes like waiting had finally become unnecessary. The next morning arrived softer than the ones before. Snow still covered the Montana hills, but sunlight stretched farther across the ridge now, turning frozen branches silver beneath a pale winter sky. Ryan Mercer stood near the kitchen stove making coffee, while something unfamiliar settled quietly inside the cabin. Not happiness exactly. Maybe less loneliness. Hard thing about grief was learning how to recognize when something heavy finally shifted, even just a little. Behind him, Shadow rested near the fireplace wrapped partly beneath an old wool blanket Ryan found in the hallway closet sometime after midnight. First time in days the German shepherd had slept deeply according to shelter records. No restless pacing. No quiet refusal to eat. Just stillness that felt peaceful instead of defeated. Ryan glanced toward him while steam drifted slowly from his coffee mug. "Guess you earned some rest," he muttered quietly. Shadow lifted his head slightly at the sound of Ryan's voice before resting again. Calm amber eyes no longer looked distant somehow. Less waiting now. Like something unfinished had finally loosened inside him too. Strange thing about healing was how quietly it often arrived. No dramatic moment. No grand realization. Just small changes people nearly missed if they were not paying attention. Later that morning, Ryan loaded Shadow carefully into the truck for a veterinary appointment in town. Wind moved gently through pine trees while mountain roads glimmered beneath fresh snow. The folder Linda packed sat near the passenger seat beside Daniel's letters Ryan still had not fully stopped thinking about. Every few minutes his mind wandered back toward one sentence written years ago in his younger brother's handwriting. "If Shadow ever finds his way back to you somehow, do not let him believe he was forgotten too." Funny thing was, Ryan had spent years believing he was the one left behind. But maybe loneliness had found both of them. Dr. Elaine Porter greeted them warmly at Blackwater Ridge Veterinary Clinic, kneeling carefully beside Shadow once Ryan helped him inside. "Well," she said softly while scratching gently behind Shadow's ears, "you are more handsome than your paperwork suggested." Shadow remained calm beneath her touch. Tired maybe, but patient. Ryan explained everything quietly. Shelter situation. Weekend foster. Hidden military history left mostly unsaid. Dr. Porter listened carefully while reviewing medical records. "Paralysis cases are complicated," she explained gently. "Sometimes full recovery does not happen." Ryan nodded once. Expected answer. Military life taught realism. "But," she continued carefully, "quality of life can improve more than people expect." Hope dangerous word again. Yet somehow it landed differently now. Therapy options. Mobility support. Hydro rehabilitation in neighboring county. Daily movement exercises. Medication adjustments. Not miracles. Just work. Ryan glanced toward Shadow. Dog stayed calm throughout the appointment despite discomfort. No fear. No resistance. Quiet resilience. Familiar kind too. Former soldiers carried themselves differently after surviving hard things. Maybe dogs did too. By afternoon, Ryan stopped at a local feed store for supplies. Joint support supplements. Better bedding. New harness designed for mobility assistance. Small town places had strange ways of remembering people. Older cashier recognized Ryan immediately. "Did not know you got yourself a dog," she said kindly. Ryan hesitated briefly before glancing toward Shadow, waiting quietly in the truck. "Neither did I," he admitted softly. Back at the cabin, winter sunlight faded slowly while Ryan spread blankets closer near the fireplace. Rearranged furniture for easier movement. Cleared pathways through narrow hallways. Strange thing was, The house stopped feeling temporary somehow. Less like survival, more like living. Shadow watched quietly through most of it. Always watching, always noticing. Later, Ryan sat on the porch steps wrapped against cold evening air while snow drifted softly through fading light. Shadow rested beside him beneath a heavy blanket, nose pointed toward distant pine ridges stretching endlessly across Montana hills. For a long while neither moved much. No need for conversation. Silence felt different now. Softer, less empty. Ryan reached into his coat pocket and unfolded one of Daniel's letters again. Read familiar handwriting beneath fading daylight. Memories arrived easier than expected now. Daniel laughing too loud after long missions. Bad jokes nobody else found funny. Late-night phone calls neither brother ever properly appreciated while they still had time. Grief remained. Of course it did. But something new sat beside it now. Responsibility, maybe. Purpose. Ryan looked down quietly toward Shadow before resting one hand gently against the dog's shoulder. "You are not going back," he said softly after a long pause. "Whatever happens." Shadow remained still for a second before lifting his head slowly and resting it against Ryan's knee exactly like the night before. No dramatic reaction. No miracle moment. Just trust. Quiet trust. And somewhere deep inside himself, Ryan realized something uncomfortable but strangely comforting all at once. Maybe saving somebody did not always feel heroic. Sometimes it looked ordinary. Sometimes healing arrived on tired mornings, veterinary paperwork, and quiet promises spoken softly enough only one broken soul could hear. And for the first time in years, Ryan Mercer no longer felt entirely alone inside his own home. 3 weeks passed quietly in the Montana mountains, and somehow winter began loosening its grip one ordinary morning at a time. Snow still covered most of the hills surrounding Ryan Mercer's cabin, but patches of earth had started showing through near the porch where sunlight lingered longer now. Healing moved like that too sometimes. Slow enough people almost missed it happening. Shadow no longer stayed curled beside the fireplace all day. Small things changed first. Appetite improved. Sleep came easier. His ears lifted quicker whenever Ryan entered a room. During morning exercises, slight movement had begun returning near one hind leg. Barely noticeable. Dr. Porter called it encouraging. Ryan called it stubbornness. Neither one minded much, which explanation proved true. Their days settled into quiet routines. Coffee before sunrise. Therapy stretches near the wood stove. Slow walks outside using the support harness whenever weather allowed. Ryan even caught himself talking more than usual. Mostly to Shadow. About weather. Old memories. Grocery lists. Things nobody expected former Navy SEALs living alone in mountain cabins to discuss aloud. Funny thing about companionship was how quickly silence changed shape. One cold Thursday afternoon, Ryan drove into Blackwater Ridge for physical therapy supplies recommended by Dr. Porter. Shadow rested comfortably inside the truck beneath blankets, watching snow drift softly through town streets. Main Street looked quieter than usual. Wind pushed loose snow across sidewalks while Christmas decorations still hung stubbornly despite January nearly ending. Ryan stopped briefly at Miller's General Store before heading back toward the truck. That was when he noticed something strange. Shadow was alert now. Very alert. Ears raised high. Body tense in a way Ryan had not seen before. Not fear. Focus. Purpose. The German Shepherd stared hard toward the edge of town near Pine Hollow Trail, where forest met residential roads. Ryan frowned slightly. "What is it?" Shadow let out one quiet sound deep in his throat. Not barking. Not distress. Recognition, maybe. Then something unexpected happened. The dog shifted with visible urgency, trying harder than usual to move toward the truck door. Ryan opened it carefully. Easy. Shadow immediately focused again toward the same direction. Watching. Waiting. Ryan followed his line of sight. At first, nothing looked unusual. Just snow. Trees. Quiet streets. Then faint movement farther ahead. Police vehicles. Flashing lights. Town volunteers gathering near trail access. Ryan recognized Sheriff Nolan standing nearby, speaking urgently into a radio. Something felt wrong. Ryan walked closer. "What happened?" Nolan turned quickly. "Missing kid," he said grimly. 9-year-old girl. Wandered from her grandmother's place about an hour ago. He glanced toward darkening skies. Storm rolling in faster than expected. Ryan looked toward the mountains. Clouds thickening already. Temperatures dropping too. Dangerous combination this time of year. Sheriff Nolan exhaled heavily. We have volunteers searching trails, but visibility is getting worse. Behind Ryan, Shadow suddenly shifted again. Focused. Alert. Watching the tree line. Ryan frowned. The German Shepherd had not stopped staring toward the same direction since arriving. You got sent articles? Ryan asked quietly. Nolan hesitated. Her scarf. Strange idea formed almost immediately. Reckless idea, maybe. Yet military instincts moved faster than doubt sometimes. Ryan looked toward Shadow. Dog remained intensely focused despite limited mobility. Waiting. Like he understood urgency better than anybody else standing nearby. Might sound crazy, Ryan said carefully. But this dog worked search operations before injury. Nolan glanced uncertainly toward Shadow. He can still do that. Ryan paused honestly. I do not know. Wind shifted colder through town streets. Time mattered now. After a long silence, Nolan handed over the scarf. Worth trying. Ryan crouched beside Shadow carefully, offering the fabric. The German Shepherd lowered his nose slowly. One breath. Then another. Something changed immediately. Eyes sharper now. Focus complete. Shadow turned instantly toward Pine Hollow Trail. Ryan saw it then. Recognition. Training. Memory waking up somewhere deeper than injury. All right, Ryan muttered softly. Show me. Snow crunched beneath boots while volunteers moved carefully through wooded trails. Ryan stayed close beside Shadow, helping support movement where terrain became harder. Progress slow at first, then steadier. Purposeful. The dog paused occasionally, nose lifting toward cold wind before continuing again. No panic. No confusion. Just quiet determination. Nearly 40 minutes later, deeper inside a wooded clearing where snow drifted thicker beneath tall pines, Shadow stopped suddenly. Ears forward. Body tense. Ryan listened carefully. At first, only wind. Then something smaller. Faint crying. Weak but unmistakable. Ryan moved toward the sound, carefully, near fallen branches partially covered in snow. There, curled beneath a pine tree with trembling hands wrapped around herself, sat a frightened little girl wearing a pink winter coat dusted white. Cold. Scared. But safe. Ryan exhaled slowly, relief arriving hard enough to nearly shake him. Hey there, he said softly, kneeling nearby. Everybody has been looking for you. The girl looked up with frightened eyes before noticing Shadow nearby. Somehow, despite everything, the German Shepherd lowered himself calmly beside her without hesitation. Quiet. Gentle. Protective. Like staying beside frightened people had once been his job too. Hours later, back in town beneath warm lights and relieved voices, Sheriff Nolan stood quietly beside Ryan, shaking his head in disbelief. That dog just saved her life, he said softly. Ryan looked toward Shadow resting tiredly inside the truck. Snow resting lightly across dark fur. Calm again now. Quiet like always. But something had changed. Not only for the town. For Ryan too. Because sometimes people gave up on broken things too early. And sometimes miracles arrived moving slower than expected, dragging old injuries behind them while quietly remembering exactly who they used to be. By the following week, people in Blackwater Ridge had started talking about the old German Shepherd nobody expected much from anymore. Small towns moved quietly, but stories traveled faster than snowstorms when something good happened. At Miller's General Store, people lowered voices near coffee shelves while mentioning the injured dog who helped find a missing little girl. At the diner downtown, Sheriff Nolan quietly corrected anyone calling it luck. That dog knew exactly what he was doing, he said more than once. Ryan Mercer mostly ignored the attention. He had spent enough years around military life to distrust praise arriving too quickly. Still, something changed after that day in the woods. Folks smiled more often when they saw Shadow riding beside him in the truck. Strangers stopped asking what happened to the dog and started asking how he was doing instead. Funny how quickly people changed once they saw somebody useful again. Yet the biggest change happened quietly back at the cabin. Shadow seemed lighter somehow. More awake. Every morning, he greeted Ryan near the kitchen instead of staying by the fire. Small improvements kept appearing where nobody expected them. Slight tail movement when Ryan returned from town. More weight carried briefly through his hind legs during therapy. Longer focus. Better balance. Dr. Porter noticed immediately during their next appointment. Something shifted, she said carefully while examining nerve responses. Ryan folded his arms nearby. Good shift. Dr. Porter hesitated. Possibly better than good. She moved Shadow's hind leg gently during the exam, watching carefully. Then she paused. Tried again. Something small happened. Barely noticeable, yet impossible to ignore. Shadow reacted before she even touched part of the lower muscle. Tiny response. Faint, but there. Dr. Porter sat back quietly. Well, she muttered softly, surprise slipping through professional calm. That should not be happening. Ryan frowned slightly. What does that mean? She reached for old records, comparing earlier evaluations beside current observations. Initial scans suggested permanent nerve damage. Another pause. But I think something may have been missed. Hope again. Dangerous word. Ryan hated how quickly it unsettled old grief. You are saying he might walk? Dr. Porter smiled carefully. I am saying we should not assume impossible too quickly. She explained it slowly afterward. Nerves sometimes responded differently over time, especially with consistent therapy, emotional stability, and movement. Recovery uncertain. No guarantees. Maybe partial improvement. Maybe more. Nobody knew yet. But for the first time since injury, possibility existed. Ryan stayed unusually quiet during the drive home. Snow melted slowly near road edges, while mountain sunlight stretched longer into evening now. Shadow rested calmly in the back seat, unaware of how one quiet appointment had shifted something enormous. Ryan kept glancing into the mirror anyway. You just keep surprising people, he muttered softly. Later that evening, while sorting through older boxes in the workshop, Ryan found something he had overlooked inside Daniel's lockbox. A smaller envelope tucked beneath mission papers. Folded carefully, handwriting familiar again. Only this one looked older somehow. More worn. Ryan sat near the workshop window while evening settled outside and carefully opened it. Inside sat one photograph and a short handwritten note. The picture showed Daniel kneeling beside a younger Shadow near military barracks years earlier. Both looked tired but strangely happy. On the back, Daniel had written something simple. He only trusts people who stay. Ryan swallowed quietly, then unfolded the note. Little brother, if you are reading this, it means life probably got strange again. I know you. You are probably pretending you do not need anybody. But if Shadow finds you someday, trust him. He sees things people miss. And if he still believes in people after everything he has seen, maybe you should too. Ryan sat there for a long time afterward. Cabin silent except for distant wind brushing through trees outside. Hard thing about grief was how quietly love stayed behind after loss. Sometimes hidden in photographs. Sometimes buried inside old letters. Sometimes dragging itself across shelter floors, refusing to give up on somebody before they gave up on themselves. Later that night, Ryan sat beside Shadow near the fireplace. Neither moved much. Firelight flickered softly across old wood walls, while winter rested peacefully beyond cabin windows. Ryan reached down slowly and scratched gently behind Shadow's ears. You know, he said quietly, voice rougher than expected, Daniel trusted you more than he trusted most people. Shadow rested calmly beside him. Ryan hesitated before saying the next part aloud. Strange thing was, it felt overdue somehow. Guess I do too. The dog lifted his head slowly then. Calm amber eyes meeting Ryan's without hesitation. Quiet understanding lived there. Familiar somehow. Like old loyalty never really disappeared. Only waited patiently until somebody finally learned how to trust it again. Outside, snow melted softly beneath warmer air drifting slowly toward spring. And somewhere between grief, old memories, and one impossible second chance, Ryan Mercer realized something he had not allowed himself to believe for years. Maybe healing did not mean forgetting what hurt. Maybe it simply meant learning how to carry it beside somebody who finally stayed. Spring arrived slowly in Blackwater Ridge the way good things often did in mountain towns, quietly enough that people almost forgot winter had once felt endless. Snow melted from the ridges first, revealing long stretches of dark earth beneath pine trees, while sunlight lingered farther across cabin windows every evening. Ryan Mercer noticed the change most during early mornings. Coffee tasted warmer somehow. Silence felt lighter. And for the first time in years, home no longer felt like somewhere he simply waited out lonely days. Nearly 3 months had passed since Shadow arrived at the cabin wrapped in shelter blankets and carrying the kind of tired sadness nobody knew how to fix anymore. Yet somehow, little by little, impossible things had begun happening. Not dramatic miracles, Quiet ones. Real ones. Shadow still moved carefully, but strength had returned farther than Dr. Porter originally expected. Some mornings he managed several assisted steps without support. Other days, with determination stronger than his body, he crossed short distances on his own before resting proudly beside the fireplace, like victories counted more when nobody bragged about them. Ryan celebrated quietly. Better meals. Longer drives into town. Extra blankets near the porch where Shadow liked resting in sunlight now. Small things. Important things. Blackwater Ridge changed too. Towns remembered kindness when they needed reminding. Sheriff Nolan stopped by occasionally with coffee and old stories. Miller's General Store kept dog treats behind the counter because the cashier insisted heroes deserved snacks. Even children waved whenever Ryan parked downtown. Especially one little girl wearing a pink winter jacket who never forgot the dog who stayed beside her in the woods until help arrived. One Saturday afternoon near the beginning of April, Ryan stood outside the old workshop holding a paintbrush while spring wind drifted softly through pine trees overhead. The building looked different now. Cleaner. Open. Alive again somehow. Weeks earlier, Ryan decided the room where Shadow uncovered Daniel's hidden memories deserved purpose instead of dust. Old military storage disappeared. Shelves replaced with books, coffee supplies, folding chairs, and quiet space for veterans passing through town who needed somewhere to sit without explaining too much. Nothing formal. No speeches. Just coffee, warmth, and understanding. Above one wall hung several framed photographs. Daniel smiling beside Shadow years earlier. Military memories. Small moments nobody else would have understood mattered. Beside them, newer pictures joined quietly. Shadow resting beside Ryan near the fireplace. Snow-covered mornings. Therapy days. Even one blurry photo Sheriff Nolan secretly snapped downtown after town children surrounded Shadow offering treats and far too much attention. Ryan never imagined grief could become something gentler. Yet somehow it had. Not gone. Never gone completely. Just carried differently now. That afternoon, while adjusting flower boxes near the porch, Ryan heard something unusual behind him. Soft movement. Slower than normal. Careful. He turned instinctively. Then froze. Shadow stood there. Not fully steady. Not perfect. But standing. For paws beneath him. No harness. No help. Only quiet determination and slightly trembling legs refusing to quit. Ryan stared for several seconds without speaking. No way, he whispered softly. Shadow took one step. Then another. Small steps. Uneven maybe. But real. Ryan swallowed hard. Something unexpectedly heavy rising quietly into his chest. Because hope felt terrifying after losing enough things. Yet here it stood anyway beneath spring sunlight, wobbling slightly across old wooden boards like the world had quietly decided impossible things deserved one more chance. Ryan crouched carefully. Come here, buddy. Shadow moved forward slowly. Steady enough. Calm. No excitement. No drama. Just quiet trust. Same way he had survived everything else. When the German shepherd finally reached him, Ryan rested one hand gently against thick fur and laughed softly for what felt like the first real time in years. Daniel would not believe this, he muttered quietly. Wind moved gently through pine branches overhead. Somewhere farther down the ridge, church bells echoed softly through town. Familiar sound. Peaceful sound. Later that evening, porch lights glowed warm against fading mountain sunlight, while Ryan and Shadow sat side by side, watching spring settle slowly across Blackwater Ridge. No words needed much anymore. Just quiet company. Shared healing. Shared survival. Before heading inside, Ryan looked once more toward the framed photograph resting near the workshop window. Daniel smiling beside a younger Shadow beneath foreign skies long ago. Funny thing about kindness was how quietly it returned when people least expected it. Sometimes through strangers. Sometimes through second chances. And sometimes through one tired old dog who crossed impossible distances carrying memories nobody else stayed long enough to protect. Ryan rested a hand gently against Shadow's shoulder before opening the cabin door. You stayed, he said softly. Shadow leaned quietly beside him like he always planned to. And somewhere beneath fading light and mountain silence, grief finally made room for something gentler. Because maybe broken things were never truly broken at all. Maybe they were simply waiting for someone patient enough to believe healing still belonged to them.